Welcome back to school. I'm your host, the board history teacher, and today we are at long last going back to one of my favorite units. This is our first unit in the Back to School series, and I'm really excited to jump into this. This is one of my favorite courses. You might have seen in the introductory video that we are studying world history, and we're starting with the first recorded civilization. We're talking about Sumeria, the Fertile Crescent. Like always, I'll go over any of the applicable vocabulary terms as we go, so hopefully things aren't too confusing. But if you are familiar with the Fertile Crescent, hopefully you are excited. Otherwise, I am excited to kind of take you on this journey. So let's get going. Hopefully this is entertaining and enjoyable. If it is, make sure you like the video, subscribe, come back for more. This is hopefully going to be the first in a long series of videos, not only on this Back to School World History series, but if things go well, I would like to do some of my other series like U.S. government, U.S. history, things like that I've taught in the past. So this whole series is just really about bringing content that I used to teach in the classroom, making it available to a wide audience, getting to go back to it myself. I'm still a teacher, but I teach alternative education now, so I don't necessarily get a chance to dive into all of the history content like I used to. This was my bread and butter for almost a decade, teaching in small town Wisconsin. So I'm excited to get back to teaching some of this stuff. So let's dive on in. We are using Prezi. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this is old Prezi. Prezi Classic, I'm not sure what they're calling it nowadays. I have a vendetta against the new version of Prezi, but that's a story for another day. So let's dive in and talk about the Fertile Crescent. This was a lesson that I created a long time ago now, it feels like, but I'm excited to dive in and bring it back to everybody. So we are talking about the Fertile Crescent. We kind of take a look here. This is the area of modern-day Iraq, Iran, down into Egypt, Israel, Syria. So you can kind of see that this takes up a big portion of what is the modern-day Middle East. And it might seem kind of ironic or different or interesting, however you want to put it, to consider this to be a fertile area. But given the Tigris and Euphrates River, as well as kind of this image includes the Nile River Valley, these areas were actually pretty fertile. There's been some desertification that has happened over the years. But especially if you kind of stick close to those rivers where flooding tended to silt up the soil, things were pretty fertile, pretty good for farming. And the first areas that we generally see pop up as civilizations where people settled down were those river valleys where the soil was particularly fertile, where it was easy to settle around these rivers that provided food, water, in some cases transportation, but most importantly, good farmland. And with good farmland, consistently refreshed farmland comes that those abilities, like we talked in the first video, to create agriculture, which allows people to not have to work for their food, which allows people to specialize, and all those things that go into creating a civilization. So Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia is another term that you'll hear. That's Greek word meso, meaning between. Potamoi or Potamia, meaning it's the ancient Greek word for rivers, between the two rivers. So when we talk about Mesopotamia, we're specifically talking about this area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They do come to a confluence here at the Persian Gulf, but the area of Mesopotamia is between those two rivers, and that was where most of these Sumerian, Babylonian, city-states would later would become. All right. So we're talking about primarily in this unit about Sumeria, Babylon, and Assyria. Again, we're following, I think I talked about it in the first introductory video, but there's a textbook that I used to use called World History Patterns of Interaction. So that's kind of what this is loosely based out of, but take that as you will. I might leave some things out. I might include some things that aren't necessarily in there, but it's going to be pretty much what you know, or what it would be. First settlements occur sometime around the year 4500 BCE. We're talking about 6,000 years ago, where we start to see some archaeological evidence. Most of these towns don't exist anymore. There's mounds of dirt, or called tells. So we get like the word for Tel Aviv. Tel just means mound. Because most of these we'll get into, but were made with mud brick, so they didn't stand the test of time. First known as the Sumerians around the year 3300. So that comes from the city-state of Sumer. That was kind of applied generally to the region that was culturally homogenous. Fertile farmland, talk about that modern-day area of Iraq. There are some major disadvantages to settling in this area. Now, the advantage was that there was fertile farmland, rivers, all that sort of things that we talked about that made the Fertile Crescent fertile, but there were some also big disadvantages. Irregular flooding, some cycles of drought. These were not necessarily consistent rivers. They were fed from the mountains in modern day Turkey and Armenia and kind of that area, the Caucasus area. And so they're mostly fed by snow melt. So in years where the snow was not as good, there were some lower floods. The less flooding that they had, the less silt that was deposited, the less the farmland would produce. However, they also had some years where the flooding was really intense and washed away towns and did a lot more damage. So the flooding wasn't as predictable and as consistent as somewhere like we'll see in Egypt, where the Nile River floods pretty consistently every year. Large open flat land, so there's very little natural defensive fortifications that we'll see. So when you get to places like Egypt that had deserts on both sides and mountains and all kinds of stuff, there are more natural barriers. When you get to the Greek city-states, they had the mountains that they could kind of build their fortifications around. Iraq is a plain for the most part, pretty wide open and flat, and so there weren't many natural fortifications. Even the two major rivers didn't provide much of a defense. Limited natural resources, so there's not a whole lot for trees or mineral resources. So a lot of the building materials ended up being mud bricks. So they would use straw layered with mud brick, and then that was primarily what they built with. So they had to trade for a lot of their resources like precious metals or even building metals like tin and bronze and things like that. So there are some advantages and disadvantages that the Babylonians had, nevertheless, and the Sumerians had. It was one of the original, kind of called the cradles of civilization, that kind of popped up here. Here we have Mesopotamia. We have some of the city-states. So Ur and Uruk make appearances in the Bible. Places like Sumer, Lagash, Kish, Babylon, Agad, Akkad. These are all city-states that play a pretty big role in this area. But again, you can see this Mesopotamian area as part of the Fertile Crescent. Tigris and Euphrates flow southeast into the Persian Gulf, and it's around the delta that a lot of these city-states popped up. When we talk about a delta, it's a triangular piece of land. If I use my annotation tool, we can kind of get an idea here, find where I'm at. So if you kind of were to draw a triangle, it's not a very good triangle, but that triangle would be, roughly speaking, the delta. It's actually a little bit bigger than that because it would include Ur and Uruk. But the letter delta, if I make a triangle, that's a little bit better. The letter delta in Greek is a triangle, right? Capital D is a triangle. And so that's where we get that term delta from. But that's where the rivers tend to fan out as they get closer to the Persian Gulf, or any river as it approaches the sea, tends to fan out and deposit a lot of its silt. That's where you get a lot more kind of interconnected waterways, a lot more silt, a lot more fertile farmland and things like that. So you can see most of these city-states popped up in the delta. So city-states. So these were all organized as city-states. They're an independent nation-like state that exists in a city. So usually these city-states functioned as controlling the city itself, the urban center, and the farmland that fed it around. So as far as you could extend your control to control that farmland, that was what you had. These cities had an army to defend themselves. Early on, and as well as today, most wars are about resources, so they would fight over things like water rights and food. So controlling farmland is important. But they had a state-level government. They had a leader. They had, in some cases, proto-democracies, but they also had religious institutions. In fact, most of these city-states are centered around religion. If you kind of see in the upper right corner of this picture here, this building is called a ziggurat. That was where the religious worship was happening in ancient Sumeria. Early on, they were ruled by temple priests. So a lot of early ancient civilizations were theocracies. If you think about, kind of who can, if a lot of and we'll talk more about their religion, but they were polytheistic, and a lot of their gods had natural powers over nature. And so, if you had a god who could control the floods, a guy who could talk to that god and who could mediate between you and the gods who were rather capricious and pretty vindictive, the person who could talk to those gods would be pretty important. So early on, they were ruled by temple priests as a middleman between the gods and the people. Later on, as warfare and foreign policy and things like that became more important, military leaders and political leaders tended to take charge. These in some cases, some city-states will go on to become dynasties. So that term dynasty will become really important, especially when we get to Egypt. But that is a family line of rulers. So when we think of kind of the European style of hereditary monarchy, where you have political leadership passed from father to son or father to mother, things like her father to daughter, in some cases mother to son, that familial line of leaders is called a dynasty. In fact, Egyptian history, when we talk about Egypt, is organized historically into dynasties. But these leadership team or styles would sometimes become dynasties. I'm going a little bit quicker than I would traditionally in class, just because we're not taking any notes. So feel free to pause the video, go back, re-listen to things. Sumerian religion was polytheistic. This is a Greek term. This will come up a lot. If we kind of break this down into the two root words, poly is the Greek word for many. Theos is the Greek word for God. So they were polygod. They were many god. They had many different gods. I don't have an exact number. But each controlled a different force of nature or a different component of creation. Enlil was the god of the flood. He was pretty powerful because the flood and wind and storms were some of the most powerful forces that they had. So those were the most powerful gods. And these gods were anthropomorphic. They had human characteristics. They were human-like. They weren't based on animals or things like that, like we see in the Egyptian pantheon. They had also human characteristics in their personality. When we tend to think of, in the modern sense, gods who are perfect, these were not those. These were gods that could be jealous and prone to rage and could make mistakes and could be vindictive and things like that. So they were really human in every sense of the term, except the fact they were immortal and had power over nature. Ziggurats were built to make sacrifices and kind of, as a go-between area for talking to the gods. They did have a sense of life after death. They had a place called the Land of No Return, where souls would go to go after you died. A lot of what we know about religion comes from texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's one of the oldest written stories that we have. The Epic of Gilgamesh is about a hero who goes into the on an adventure and ends up interacting with a lot of the different gods and things like that. So it's a pretty cool story. If you ever have a chance to read it, highly recommend it. But the Epic of Gilgamesh is what we know, where we get a lot of our knowledge about ancient Sumerian religion from. But pretty cool stuff. I mean, I'm not going to go super in depth. This is kind of a historical overview. I have taught a class on mythology, so if there's ever interest in that, I would love to do a back to school mythology series, where I'd go and dig up my old mythology stuff, where we do go a lot more into depth on the mythology and origin stories and all that kind of stuff. But for the sake of talking about kind of a world history overview, just know that they're polytheistic, anthropomorphic, and controlled nature. Sumerian culture was pretty actually. There's some things in history that change, and there's some things that stay the same. And Sumerian culture would actually probably look pretty familiar. They had the beginning of a social class system. This is something that pops up in a lot of societies. At the very top, they had kings, landowners, and priests, followed by wealthy merchants. Those are people who were trading, and so those are people who had a lot of access to things that people wanted, so they were important. Then field workers and unskilled workers, and unfortunately, like most ancient societies, there was a slave class. There was a division between male and female, but it was much more egalitarian than a lot of other ancient civilizations. Some upper-class women had educations, could read and write. Women were allowed to work in many occupations, and in general, they're going to have a lot more rights than they would in later civilizations. A lot of times, the more advanced civilizations become, the less rights women had until pretty recently. If you look at hunter-gatherer societies and things like that, they're much more egalitarian. So we're still pretty close to, those Neolithic kind of hunter-gatherer societies, so women still have a lot of rights. We get a lot of our current math and science from the Sumerians. They had a base 60 system of counting, which seems kind of wild from our base 10, but that's where we get 60 seconds equals a minute. I made a typo there. So it's where we get things divided into 60. So circles are divided into 360 segments, 60 seconds to 1 minute, 60 minutes to 1 hour, and then we even have, divisible portions of 6 into 24. They had columns, arches, ramps, all developed under their science. And they had the first form of writing that we're aware of called cuneiform. Cuneiform was written onto clay tablets, so they would actually have something that they had in abundance living near a river was clay, and so they would use clay pushed into frames, pressed into frames, and then it actually made a really nice reusable tablet. So you could write on it, you could use it to record things, and then you could still kind of wipe it clean if you needed to. And a lot of the tablets that we have to read today were either naturally left to dry and solidified, or they were in fires or things like that, where they were, artificially kiln dried, for lack of a better term. But they would use a triangle-shaped stylus, and they would press the stylus into the clay. It was a symbolic writing form, where rather than alphabetic, so they would use symbols to represent things. So it was a pictographic language rather than alphabetic language, like we would be more familiar with today. But it was a full written language, and a lot of what we have is pretty boring. It's tax records, it's receipts for trades and things like that, laws that were passed down, mostly government texts, because reading and writing was something that was still pretty reserved for a select few that were highly educated and connected. So unless you were a scribe and you worked in some sort of official capacity, it was unlikely that you were writing things down by and large. Keep accidentally clicking off of things. There we go. Sorry to be sliding around. This is a full teacher experience. First, empires. So an empire is any time where you get multiple cultures, multiple people groups controlled under one leader. So from 3000 to 2000 BC, there's a near state of constant war between the different city-states, trying to vie for resources and power. Has weakened their ability to withstand attack from outside. And so the first major empire is the Akkadian Empire, Sargon of Akkad. Talked about the Akkad back in the Sumerian picture. He comes in, he sweeps through, and this is a pretty repetitive cycle, but he ends up adapting many pieces of Sumerian culture into the Akkadian Empire. A few hundred years later, the Babylonians come through. They were nomadic warriors from kind of the area between Iraq and Iran. And they sweep in around the year 2000. One of the most famous of the Babylonian kings is a king by the name of Hammurabi. 1792, he writes down a code of laws, which we still have preserved today because it was found mostly intact. And the Hammurabi code is pretty interesting. Again, if you get a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. Well, it is, it's where we get the term an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth from. And while the punishments might seem pretty draconian today, a lot of the issues that you see as you kind of read through and read into it are pretty modern. They're dealing with issues of divorce and honesty in business and, land policies, and they're building codes and all kinds of things in there that, well, we're not necessarily throwing a carpenter into a burning house. If the house collapses, but we do have those same issues today, wanting to ensure that the buildings we live in are safe, and wanting to make sure that business people are being honest, and wanting to make sure that we have ways to prove provenance of ownership of different things. So Code of Hammurabi is pretty interesting to read through. As the years would tick on, different groups like the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, the Hebrews would all kind of successively take over all or part of the Fertile Crescent. Because going back to those things about the lack of or lack of natural resources and lack of natural defenses, if you got a powerful outside empire that could sweep in, it was pretty hard to throw them off. And so then you would get these empires who would come in, they'd be powerful, their power would wane, and then the next person on the totem pole would come through and do that as well. And so this is an area of the world where, we kind of think today of it being pretty, um, unsettled, but this has been going on since the very beginning of time of civilization for this area of the world, where it's been changing hands, every few hundred years for millennia. And that's the Mesopotamians. So they're pretty interesting people because they're one of the first groups of people that we have in history, quite literally. There's not a whole lot about them unless we want to get really deep into the weeds and bring in things like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Code of Hammurabi, which isn't really what this series is designed for. So I hope you really enjoyed this. Our next session is going to be all about the Egyptians, which should be a little bit more familiar for most people. But I hope you really enjoyed this back to school episode on the Sumerians, and make sure you subscribe and click the bell if you want to see the next time we make any videos. And I really appreciate you sticking around. Have a great day.